deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers don't reach and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away. Sarah Martinez stood before a pile of rotting wood that used to be her grandfather's cabin. 8 months pregnant, betrayed by the man she loved, and with only $300 to her name, she had nowhere else to go. What her cheating husband didn't know was that Sarah wasn't just some helpless housewife. Before marriage stripped away her identity, she'd been a master carpenter, following in her grandfather's footsteps, building custom homes that sold for millions. Her calloused hands remembered every technique he'd taught her during those magical childhood summers. Now, as winter approached and her baby's due date loomed, she had 8 weeks to turn this wreckage into a home. But when she pried up the floorboards, she found something that changed everything. Her grandfather's hidden journal revealing a truth about her family that someone had killed to keep buried. Could she rebuild more than just walls before her past caught up with her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air bit at Sarah's cheeks as she stepped over a fallen beam that had once supported the cabin's front porch. 3 days had passed since she'd fled Phoenix with nothing but a hastily packed duffel bag and the rusty keys her grandfather had pressed into her palm before his death 2 years ago. She'd never imagined she'd actually use them. Behind her, the ancient Jeep Cherokee wheezed and clicked as its engine cooled. The vehicle had cost her $200 from a sketchy lot outside Flagstaff, leaving her with $100 and whatever change rattled in her purse. The seller had laughed when she'd asked about the warranty. Sarah pressed one hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her. "Just you and me now, little one," she whispered, though her voice caught on the words. Even 48 hours later, the image of Marcus tangled in their bed with her sister Jessica burned behind her eyelids like a brand. The betrayal had been surgical in its precision. Marcus, with his pressed suits and practiced smile, had convinced her to quit her carpentry business after they married. "A Martinez woman doesn't need to work with her hands," he'd said, stroking her cheek. "Let me take care of you." She'd been so stupidly grateful, so eager to play house, that she'd sold her tools and let her contractor's license lapse. Now she understood why he'd been so insistent. Dependent women were easier to discard. Sarah forced herself to focus on the cabin's bones, the way Grandpa Ernesto had taught her. Look past the decay, find the foundation, see what could be saved. The main support beams were solid lodgepole pine, weathered but intact. The stone chimney had lost some mortar, but remained structurally sound. She could work with this. A flutter in her womb reminded her of the clock ticking inside her body. 8 weeks, until her due date, maybe less if the baby decided to come early like she had. The nearest hospital was in Durango, 2 hours of winding mountain roads away. She'd have to pray her cell phone could catch enough signal when the time came. The front door hung askew on broken hinges, revealing the cabin's dark interior. Sarah pulled a flashlight from her bag and stepped inside, floorboards groaning ominously under her weight. Decades of neglect had stripped the place to its skeleton. Water damage had warped the wooden floors, and something small scurried away from her light beam. But there were treasures, too. Grandpa's hand-forged iron hardware still gleamed under layers of dust. The massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened but intact. She could almost see him there, pipe smoke curling around his weathered face as he told stories of the old country and the fortune their family had lost. Sarah knelt carefully and ran her hands over the floorboards near the fireplace. These planks were different, narrower and slightly raised, as if they'd been replaced more recently. Her grandfather had been meticulous about his work. Inconsistencies meant something. She wedged her fingers under the edge of one board and pulled. It came up easily, revealing a gap in the subfloor. Her flashlight beam caught the edge of something leather-bound. The journal was wrapped in oiled canvas, protected from moisture and time. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized her grandfather's careful handwriting on the cover, "Para Sara, cuando esté lista para la verdad." For Sarah, when she's ready for the truth. Her hands trembling, she opened to the first page. The date was from 6 months before Grandpa's death, and the first line made her blood freeze. They think they killed the last witness, but they're wrong. The Cortez mine documents are still here, and Sarah needs to know what really happened to her father. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window frames like skeleton fingers. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and kept reading, unaware that in a corporate office 400 miles away, someone had just received word that Ernesto Martinez's granddaughter had finally returned to Colorado. The gravel roads stretched endlessly ahead, each mile taking Sarah deeper into the kind of isolation she'd never experienced. Her Honda's GPS had given up 2 hours ago, leaving her with only her grandfather's hand-drawn map and increasingly unreliable cell service. The baby kicked against her ribs as if protesting this journey into the unknown. She'd left Marcus sleeping in their king-sized bed, probably dreaming of Rebecca's perfectly manicured hands. The note she'd left was brief: "Don't look for me." Let him explain her absence to his colleagues, his mother, their friends. Let him spin whatever story would preserve his precious reputation. The forest pressed closer now, towering pines creating a canopy so thick that afternoon felt like dusk. Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel, though whether from exhaustion, pregnancy hormones, or the magnitude of what she was doing she couldn't say. She'd driven 12 hours straight, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks, surviving on determination and stale granola bars. According to the map, she should be close. Grandpa Joe had drawn the route in his careful script during one of his final lucid moments, pressing the folded paper into her palm with surprising urgency. "Promise me," he'd whispered, his eyes clearer than they'd been in months. "If you ever need sanctuary, you'll remember the cabin." At the time, she'd assumed it was dementia talking. Now, fleeing her imploded life, those words felt prophetic. The turnoff appeared suddenly, a gap in the trees barely wide enough for her car, marked by a weathered wooden post. Sarah almost missed it in the gathering shadows. She turned, her Honda bouncing over ruts and fallen branches. The baby responded with another sharp kick, and she pressed a hand to her belly. "Almost there, little one," she murmured. "Almost home." The word surprised her. Home. She'd never seen this place. But something about the dense silence, broken only by her engine and the whisper of wind through branches, felt right in a way their sterile suburban house never had. The cabin materialized like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. 2 stories of weathered logs and broken dreams, windows dark as dead eyes, the front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Ivy and blackberry vines had claimed the walls, and the roof showed patches of missing shingles like bald spots. A stone chimney rose crookedly toward the sky, several bricks missing from its crown. Sarah killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence, overwhelmed. What had she been thinking? She was 6 months pregnant, alone, and staring at a structure that looked ready to collapse. Her savings account held maybe 3 months of living expenses, less if she had to pay for extensive repairs. This wasn't sanctuary, this was madness. But returning to Marcus wasn't an option. The image of him and Rebecca tangled in hotel sheets burned too fresh, too raw. She'd rather face whatever dangers lurked in these woods than spend another moment pretending their marriage could survive his betrayal. The cabin key was exactly where Grandpa Joe had said it would be, under the 3rd loose board on the porch steps. The brass had turned green with age, but it slid smoothly into the heavy wooden door. The lock clicked open with a sound like an exhaled breath. Inside, dust motes danced in the fading light that struggled through grimy windows. The air smelled of old wood, must, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Sarah fumbled for a light switch, found one, and was surprised when electricity flickered to life. Grandpa Joe must have kept the utilities running even after he'd moved to the assisted living facility. The main room was larger than expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a kitchen tucked into the far corner. Furniture huddled under white sheets like ghosts waiting to be awakened. A narrow staircase led to what she assumed were bedrooms. Sarah pulled the sheet from the nearest armchair and immediately wished she hadn't. Underneath, The upholstery was shredded, stuffing scattered across the floor. Deep gouges scored the wooden frame, claw marks that looked too large to belong to any house cat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Bears, probably, or raccoons. The cabin had stood empty for 3 years. Of course, animals had gotten inside. The logical explanation didn't stop her from backing toward the door, every horror movie she'd ever seen flooding her memory. But where could she go? The nearest town was an hour away, and her credit card was nearly maxed out. She had enough cash for maybe one night in a motel, and then what? Return to Marcus with her tail between her legs? Beg forgiveness for running away after discovering his affair? The baby shifted, a gentle reminder of who else depended on her now. This child deserved better than a broken home built on lies and betrayal. Whatever lurked in these woods, whatever secrets these walls held, they couldn't be worse than the life she'd left behind. Sarah squared her shoulders and stepped deeper into her grandfather's cabin, ready to fight for the fresh start they both needed. The morning light filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Sarah's back ached from sleeping on the old couch, but she felt more rested than she had in weeks. For the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, she had slept through the night without jolting awake in a cold sweat. She pressed her hand to her rounded belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement within. "Good morning, little one," she whispered. "Ready to see what we're working with?" The cabin looked even worse in daylight. Water damage had warped the floorboards near the kitchen, and she could see daylight through several gaps in the roof. But beneath the neglect, she recognized the bones of something beautiful. The hand-hewn beams her grandfather had told her about, the stone fireplace he'd built with rocks from the nearby creek. Sarah found a broom in the kitchen closet and began sweeping, each stroke stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the morning sun. As she worked, memories surfaced of summer visits when she was young. Grandpa Joe teaching her to identify different bird calls, showing her which berries were safe to eat, explaining how he'd chosen this spot because it was sheltered from the worst winds, but still caught the morning light. "Your great-great-grandfather homesteaded this land," he'd told her once as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Said it called to him the moment he saw it. "Sometimes a place chooses you, Sadie. You don't choose it." She'd been Sadie to him always, never Sarah. The nickname felt like a warm hug now, a reminder that she belonged here in ways Marcus had never understood. He'd always been puzzled by her stories of the cabin, suggesting they sell the land after Grandpa Joe died instead of paying taxes on what he called worthless wilderness. The baby kicked, and Sarah paused in her sweeping. She needed to eat something, but her supplies from yesterday were already running low. The nearest town was 40 minutes away. She remembered passing it on the drive up. Ridge Creek, population maybe 3,000 if she was generous. She'd need to venture out for groceries, and probably some basic tools if she was serious about making this place habitable. The thought of facing people made her stomach clench. What if someone recognized her? The local news had covered Marcus's campaign extensively, and her face had been in plenty of photos at his side, the dutiful candidate's wife with her perfectly styled hair and practiced smile. But she couldn't hide forever. The baby would need things soon, a proper nursery, a crib, all the preparations she'd been making in the house that was no longer hers. Sarah made a mental list as she continued cleaning. Food, basic tools, lumber for the worst of the roof damage. She'd managed her own finances before marriage, had even flipped a small house in college with her roommate. How hard could it be? By noon, she'd cleared most of the main room and kitchen. The work felt good, purposeful in a way her old life had rarely been. No committees to organize, no donor dinners to plan, no carefully worded statements to approve, just her hands, the broom, and the gradual transformation of chaos into order. She was dragging a broken chair toward the door when her foot caught on a loose floorboard near the fireplace. The board tilted up, revealing a dark space beneath. Sarah knelt carefully, her belly making the movement awkward, and pried the board up further. There was definitely a hollow space underneath, maybe 8 inches deep. She grabbed her phone and activated the flashlight, peering into the gap. Her breath caught. A wooden box sat nestled in the space, small enough to fit in her hands but clearly old. The wood was dark with age, and brass hinges gleamed dully in the phone's light. It looked deliberately hidden, not just forgotten. Sarah reached down and lifted it out. The box was heavier than expected, something substantial inside. A brass latch held it closed, green with tarnish but still functional. Her fingers trembled as she worked it open. Inside, wrapped in what had once been white cloth, lay a stack of papers tied with string. Beneath them, something that made her pulse quicken, a thick roll of bills, old but well preserved. She lifted the papers carefully and untied the string. The first document made her frown. It was a deed, but not to this property. The legal description was for land she didn't recognize, somewhere called Devil's Canyon, dated 1952. Her great-great-grandfather's name was on it, along with another signature she couldn't make out. The second paper made her blood run cold. A birth certificate, yellowed with age, for a child born in 1953. The mother's name was listed as Ruth Whitmore, a name that meant nothing to her. But the father's name was clear enough, Joseph Whitmore, her grandfather's name. The baby she'd never heard of had been born a full year before her grandmother married Grandpa Joe. The morning sun filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, casting dusty beams across the cabin floor. Elena wrapped her grandfather's old wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and surveyed the damage by daylight. What had seemed merely neglected in yesterday's fading light now revealed itself as a disaster. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like dark flowers, and she could see daylight through several places in the roof. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. She'd stopped reading his messages after the 15th apology, each one more desperate than the last. "Elena, please, let me explain. The baby needs stability." As if he cared about stability when he was sleeping with his research assistant for God knows how long. She silenced the phone and tucked it into her jacket pocket. The baby kicked, a flutter that reminded her why she was here, not running away, but running toward something, a future she could control. The tool shed behind the cabin was in better condition than the house itself, protected by sturdy pine walls. Inside, she found her grandfather's tools exactly where he'd left them, arranged with military precision on pegboard walls. Hammers, saws, levels, and measuring tapes. A note in his careful handwriting was tacked to the workbench. "A job worth doing is worth doing right. GM." Elena smiled despite everything. Grandpa Miguel had been a man of few words but infinite patience. He'd taught her to drive his old pickup truck when she was 12, letting her practice in the clearing until she could handle the clutch without stalling. "Mija," he'd say when she got frustrated, "everything worth having takes time." She selected a hammer and pry bar, then headed back to the cabin. The first order of business was the roof. If she couldn't stop the water, nothing else mattered. The ladder she found leaning against the shed was rickety but functional. As she climbed, each rung creaking under her weight, Elena tried not to think about being pregnant and 20 feet off the ground. The baby was still small enough that her balance wasn't affected, but caution whispered warnings she chose to ignore. From the roof, the view stretched endlessly through towering pines and distant mountains. No neighbors, no traffic, no sounds except wind and birdsong. She could see why her grandfather had chosen this place after retiring from the construction company. It was a world away from everything. The missing shingles told a story of years of neglect. Squirrels had made homes in the gaps, and one section had rotted completely through. Elena marked the worst spots with chalk from the tool shed, mentally calculating materials and costs. Her savings account held enough for basics, though barely. Marcus could keep his guilt money, and his lawyer drafted explanations. By noon, she'd cleared debris from the gutters and pulled loose shingles. Her hands were scraped raw, and her back ached, but the physical work felt good, productive. Each nail she pulled was a small victory against the chaos of her life. She was prying up a stubborn board when it came loose suddenly, revealing something unexpected underneath. A metal box, about the size of a cigar case, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked between the rafters. Elena sat back on her heels, staring at it. The box wasn't random debris. Someone had hidden it deliberately, choosing a spot where it would stay dry and secure. Her grandfather? But why hide something in the roof? Elena climbed down carefully, the mysterious box tucked inside her jacket. Back in the cabin, she unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling fingers. The metal was old but well preserved, with a simple latch that opened with a soft click. Inside lay a stack of photographs and documents. The top photo showed a much younger version of her grandfather standing beside a woman Elena didn't recognize. They were in front of what looked like this very cabin, but it was different somehow, newer. The woman was beautiful, with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple dress from what looked like the 1960s. Elena flipped the photo over. In her grandfather's handwriting, Maria and Miguel, 1967. Our beginning, but that was impossible. Elena's grandmother had been named Catherine, and she'd died when Elena was too young to remember her. This Maria looked nothing like the few photos Elena had seen of her grandmother. She rifled through the other photos with growing confusion. More pictures of Miguel and Maria, wedding photos, pictures of them working on the cabin together, Maria laughing as she painted window frames while wearing Miguel's oversized flannel shirt. At the bottom of the stack was a marriage certificate. Miguel Santos and Maria Elena Vasquez, married June 15, 1967, in Copper Falls, Colorado. Elena's middle name was Maria, after her grandmother. At least, that's what she'd always been told. The document shook in her hands as implications crashed over her. If this marriage certificate was real, then everything she'd been told about her family history was a lie. The morning light filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, casting thin golden lines across the dusty floor. Sarah had slept fitfully on the old mattress she'd dragged down from upstairs, her dreams filled with creaking timbers and whispered voices that seemed to drift through the walls. Now, as she sat up and stretched her aching back, the events of the previous day felt both distant and immediate, like a half-remembered nightmare that refused to fade. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the subtle curve that had become more pronounced in recent weeks. The baby was still small, still a secret she could hide beneath loose clothing, but its presence was a constant reminder of the ticking clock that drove her forward. She needed to make this place livable, and she needed to do it fast. After a breakfast of granola bars and lukewarm coffee from her thermos, Sarah ventured back into the basement. The wooden box sat where she'd left it, its brass corners gleaming despite the patina of age. She'd closed it hastily the night before, unsettled by the implications of what she'd found, but now daylight made everything seem less ominous. Almost. The photographs were still there, still depicting scenes that made no sense in the context of what she knew about her grandfather. Harold Brennan had been a quiet man who'd worked at the lumber mill, raised 3 children with her grandmother, Rose, and attended church every Sunday without fail. He wasn't the kind of man who associated with people in expensive suits or participated in mysterious nighttime gatherings. Sarah spread the photos across the basement floor, studying them more carefully. In several, she could make out a younger version of her grandfather, his face serious but recognizable. The other men remained strangers, but there was something about their posture, their proximity to each other, that suggested familiarity, partnership even. Beneath the photographs, she found a leather-bound ledger filled with her grandfather's careful handwriting. The entries were dated, spanning several years in the 1960s, but the content was cryptic. Numbers, initials, and brief notations that could have been inventory records or something far more sinister. JM, 200 cases, North Route cleared. RD confirms sheriff's schedule. Window Tuesday, Thursday after midnight. New contact in Montreal, 15% increase agreed. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Sheriff's schedules, routes, Montreal connections. The pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve were arranging themselves with uncomfortable clarity. A sudden sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the main floor. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered the photographs and ledger, shoving them back into the box. The footsteps paused directly overhead. "Hello?" a voice called out. Male, older, unfamiliar. "Anyone in there?" Sarah climbed the basement stairs on silent feet, clutching the wooden box against her chest. Through a gap in the front window boards, she could see a pickup truck parked beside her car. The license plate was local. "I saw the light last night," the voice continued, "just checking to make sure everything's all right." She made a quick decision. Hiding would only make her seem more suspicious, and she was going to need the goodwill of her neighbors if she planned to stay. Sarah set the box down behind the kitchen counter and approached the front door. The man standing on her porch was perhaps 60, with weathered skin and kind eyes. He wore a flannel shirt and work boots, and his smile seemed genuine enough. "Sorry to bother you," he said when she opened the door. "I'm Tom Henley. Live about 2 miles down the road. This place has been empty for so long I figured I should introduce myself." "Sarah Brennan," she replied, noting how his expression shifted slightly at the name. "Harold was my grandfather." "Well, I'll be damned." Tom's smile widened, but something flickered behind his eyes, surprise or perhaps concern. "Harold's granddaughter. He used to talk about you kids when you were little. Haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone from the family since the funeral." "I'm renovating," Sarah said simply. "Planning to stay for a while." Tom nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the boarded windows and general state of disrepair. "That's quite a project you've got ahead of you. This place has been through some hard winters. Your grandfather, he was a good man, but he let things go toward the end." There was something in the way he said it, an emphasis that suggested layers of meaning. Sarah found herself studying his face, wondering if Tom Henley was someone who might appear in her grandfather's cryptic ledger entries. "Did you know him well?" she asked. "Well enough," Tom replied, but his tone had grown cautious. "Small community up here. We all knew each other." He glanced past her into the cabin's interior. "You planning to tackle this alone? Might be I could lend a hand with some of the heavier work." The offer seemed genuine, but Sarah's newfound paranoia made her hesitate. In the space of that hesitation, Tom's expression shifted again, becoming more guarded. "That's very kind," she said finally. "Let me get settled first." Tom nodded and stepped back. "You know where to find me if you change your mind." He paused at the edge of the porch. "Be careful up here, Sarah. These old places, they can be full of surprises." The morning light filtered through the plastic sheeting Maya had tacked over the broken kitchen window, casting everything in an amber glow. She pressed her hand to her lower back and stretched, feeling the familiar ache that came from sleeping on the lumpy mattress she'd dragged down from upstairs. At 22 weeks pregnant, her body was demanding more comfort than the cabin could provide, but she wasn't ready to give up. 3 days had passed since she'd found the photographs, and they haunted her thoughts like persistent shadows. Every creak of the old floorboards made her wonder what other secrets lay hidden within these walls. She'd searched the rest of the desk drawers, but found nothing more than yellowed receipts and her grandfather's careful handwriting documenting expenses for repairs that had never been completed. Maya wrapped her grandfather's old flannel shirt tighter around herself and made her way to the kitchen. The coffee maker was one of the few modern appliances that still worked, though the coffee itself came from a can she'd found in the back of a cupboard. It tasted like dust and regret, but it was warm and caffeinated, which was enough. As she waited for the ancient machine to finish gurgling, movement outside the window caught her eye. A figure was walking up the overgrown path toward the cabin, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. She hadn't seen another soul since arriving, and the isolation had become both a comfort and a source of anxiety. The man who approached was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of outdoor work. He wore a faded denim jacket and moved with the easy gait of someone familiar with the terrain. When he knocked on the door, it was gentle but persistent. Maya hesitated, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. Through the warped glass, she could see him step back, giving her space, his posture non-threatening but patient. "Maya?" His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place. "Maya Chen? I'm Tom Brennan. I live about 2 miles down the mountain." The name meant nothing to her, but something in his tone suggested he knew more about her presence here than a casual neighbor should. She opened the door but kept the chain latched. "How do you know my name?" Tom's smile was apologetic but kind. "Word travels fast up here. Mrs. Patterson at the general store mentioned someone was staying at the old Chen place, figured it had to be family." He paused, studying her face with curious blue eyes. "You look just like him, you know. Your grandfather." Maya's grip on the door loosened slightly. "You knew him?" "Known Henry for almost 15 years, until he passed. Good man. Kept to himself mostly, but he'd help anyone who needed it." Tom gestured toward the cabin's exterior, where Maya's repair attempts were visible in the form of new boards and fresh caulking around the windows. "Looks like you inherited more than just his property." Despite herself, Maya felt a small smile tug at her lips. She unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. Tom's presence felt safe somehow, like an anchor to the normal world she'd left behind. "Would you like some coffee? It's terrible, but it's hot." "I'd appreciate that." Tom stepped inside, his eyes taking in the improvements Maya had made. "You've done good work here. Henry would be proud." As Maya poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, Tom settled at the kitchen table. His presence filled the space in a way that felt comfortable rather than intrusive, and for the first time in weeks, Maya didn't feel completely alone. "Can I ask you something?" Maya set the coffee in front of him and took the opposite chair, cradling her own mug between her palms. "Shoot. Did my grandfather ever mention family? Other than me, I mean?" Tom's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightness around his eyes that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Henry was private about his past." "Why do you ask?" Maya hesitated, then decided to trust her instincts. "I found some old photographs, pictures of a woman and a little girl. The woman looked—" She paused, unsure how to articulate the resemblance that had unsettled her so deeply. "She looked like she could be related to me." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it held answers. When he finally looked up, his expression was troubled. "Maya, there are some things about your grandfather's life that aren't my story to tell. But if you're planning to stay here for a while, you should know that Henry left this place for good reasons, and he came back for even better ones." The weight of his words settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing her sudden unease. "What kind of reasons?" Tom stood, leaving his coffee barely touched. "The kind that might be better left buried." The old leather journal felt heavy in Sarah's hands as she sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, her back against the newly reinforced wall. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the yellowed pages. She'd found it wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard while installing new insulation that morning, hidden so deliberately that discovering it felt like destiny. Her grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the pages in faded blue ink, each entry dated meticulously. She flipped to a random page, her heart racing as she began to read. September 15th, 1967. They came again today. Henderson and his boys asking questions about the summer of '58. I told them what I always tell them. I don't know nothing about what happened to that girl, but the truth burns in my chest like swallowed fire. Eleanor Marsh didn't just disappear into thin air like they think." Sarah's blood chilled. Eleanor Marsh. She remembered that name from childhood whispers, fragments of conversations that adults would abandon when children entered the room. The local girl who vanished without a trace, becoming the mountain's most enduring mystery. She turned the page with trembling fingers. "I keep telling myself I had no choice. She was going to destroy everything, my family, my reputation, the life I'd built. When she threatened to tell Margaret about us, about the baby, I saw red. I never meant for it to go so far." The baby kicked sharply against Sarah's ribs, as if responding to the horrific revelation. She pressed her hand to her swollen belly, her grandfather's words blurring as tears filled her eyes. The man who'd taught her to whittle, who'd carried her on his shoulders through these very woods, was confessing to murder. October 3rd, 1967, buried her deep in the old mine shaft, up Raven's Ridge. Covered it good with rocks and debris. No one goes up there anymore since the cave-in. She'll rest there until Judgment Day, and so will my secret. Sarah slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking violently. The cabin suddenly felt suffocating, its walls pressing in on her like a coffin. She struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making every movement awkward, and stumbled to the door. The cool mountain air hit her face like a slap, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside her. She leaned against the porch railing, gulping down oxygen as her mind raced. Everything she thought she knew about her grandfather, about this place that had become her sanctuary, was a lie built on a foundation of bones and secrets. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the clearing, and Sarah's head jerked up. She squinted into the forest, her heart hammering. Nothing moved among the trees, but the feeling of being watched crawled across her skin like insects. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence answered her, heavy and pregnant with menace. She backed toward the cabin door, one hand on her belly, the other fumbling for the handle. As she turned to go inside, a glint of metal caught her eye from the tree line, there and gone so quickly she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Back inside, Sarah double-checked the locks and pulled the curtains tight. The journal lay where she'd dropped it, its presence seeming to poison the air around it. She knew she should burn it, destroy the evidence of her grandfather's crime, but something held her back. Maybe it was the thought of Eleanor Marsh, alone in that mine shaft for over 50 years, her family never knowing what happened to her. Sarah picked up the journal again, her hands steadier now. If she was going to learn the truth, she needed all of it. She flipped to an entry near the back. December 20th, 1985. Sarah asked about the locked room again today. "That girl's too curious for her own good. I've hidden everything, but she's got her grandmother's sharp eyes. If something happens to me, if the truth comes out, she needs to know it wasn't just about Eleanor. There were others before her. The mine shaft holds more secrets than one man's shame." Others. Sarah's stomach lurched as the implications hit her. Her grandfather hadn't just killed Eleanor Marsh, he was a serial killer. And now she was alone in his hunting ground, carrying his blood in her veins. A sound from outside made her freeze, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Sarah crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A shadowy figure moved just beyond the reach of the porch light, too indistinct to make out clearly. Her phone had no signal, as always. The nearest neighbor was miles away. And somewhere out there, someone knew she'd found the journal. Someone who'd been watching, waiting for this moment. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the door. Sarah held her breath, the journal clutched against her chest like a shield. In the silence, she could hear her own heartbeat and something else, the soft sound of breathing from the other side of the door. The floorboard came up easier than expected, revealing a hollow space beneath that hadn't seen light in decades. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into the darkness, her fingers finding the edge of what felt like a leather portfolio tied with string. The musty smell of old paper and secrets wafted up from the hiding spot. She pulled the bundle into the lamplight, her heart hammering against her ribs. The leather was cracked and worn, the string brittle with age. As she carefully untied it, photographs spilled onto the floor around her swollen ankles, black and white images of people she didn't recognize, but whose faces held an unsettling familiarity. The first photograph showed a young woman, who could have been Sarah's twin, standing beside a man in a military uniform. The woman's hand rested protectively over a rounded belly, and her smile seemed forced, as if she were trying to convince herself of happiness she didn't feel. Sarah's breath caught. She flipped the photograph over and found her grandfather's careful handwriting, Margaret, 1943. 3 months before, the rest was smudged beyond recognition. Margaret. Her grandmother's name was Eleanor, not Margaret. Sarah had seen the wedding photographs, the marriage certificate. Who was this woman who looked so much like her? More photographs revealed a story she'd never heard. Margaret holding a baby, but her eyes were hollow, haunted. Margaret standing in front of this very cabin, but it looked different, newer, loved. Margaret with the same man in uniform, but now they stood apart from each other, the distance between them speaking volumes about what had transpired. At the bottom of the pile, Sarah found documents that made her blood run cold. A birth certificate for Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, born the same year as her grandmother Eleanor. Death records, hospital admission papers with phrases that made her stomach churn, mental instability following childbirth. Patient exhibits violent tendencies, recommended indefinite commitment. The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a hand to her belly and continued reading, though every instinct screamed at her to stop, to burn these papers, and pretend she'd never found them. A letter in her grandfather's handwriting, never sent, dated 6 months after Margaret's death. I told everyone she died in childbirth. It was easier than explaining that I had her committed, that I took the baby and gave it to Eleanor to raise as our own. Margaret wasn't sick. She was inconvenient. She knew about the others, the missing women from town. She threatened to go to the authorities. I couldn't let that happen. The Morrison name, our family's standing in the community, it was worth more than one woman's accusations. Even if they were true, Sarah's vision blurred as she read the final lines. The baby will never know. Eleanor believes she's the mother, and that's how it will stay. Some secrets are worth keeping, no matter the cost. The cabin holds too many memories now. I'll board it up, let the forest reclaim it. Maybe that will quiet Margaret's voice that still calls to me from the trees. The letter fluttered from Sarah's numb fingers. Margaret wasn't her grandmother. She was her real grandmother. Eleanor had raised a child that wasn't biologically hers, believing she was the mother, which meant her father was Margaret's son, not Eleanor's. And Margaret had died not in childbirth, but in an asylum where her own husband had committed her to silence her knowledge of something terrible. Thunder rumbled overhead, and rain began pattering against the cabin roof. Sarah gathered the photographs and documents with shaking hands, her mind reeling. The missing women Margaret had known about, what had happened to them, and what did her grandfather mean by the others? A sound outside made her freeze. Not thunder this time, but the distinct crunch of footsteps on gravel. Sarah quickly stuffed the papers back into the leather portfolio and listened. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. She crawled to the window and peered through the gap in the boards she'd left for ventilation. A figure stood at the tree line, barely visible in the growing darkness. Tall, wearing what looked like a rain jacket with the hood pulled up. The person seemed to be watching the cabin, waiting. Sarah's pulse quickened. She'd seen no one for days, had begun to believe she was truly alone out here, but someone knew she was here. Someone was watching. The figure began moving closer to the cabin, and Sarah saw the glint of something metallic in their hand. She pressed herself against the wall, clutching the leather portfolio to her chest. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows, a warning carried on the wind and rain. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. In the silence that followed, Sarah realized that whatever dark secrets her grandfather had tried to bury with this cabin, they weren't ready to stay buried, and whoever stood outside knew exactly why she was here. The basement floor felt different under her knees the next morning. What she'd assumed was packed earth revealed itself to be something else entirely as she brushed away decades of dust and debris. Smooth stones, carefully laid in a deliberate pattern, emerged from beneath the grime. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of what looked like fitted flagstones, each one perfectly shaped to interlock with its neighbors. This wasn't the rough foundation work she'd expected in a simple mountain cabin. This was craftsmanship that spoke of intention, of permanence, of secrets worth keeping underground. Her grandfather's journal lay open beside her, morning sunlight filtering through the basement's single window to illuminate his careful handwriting. She'd been reading the same passage over and over, trying to make sense of entries that seemed to describe renovations that had never happened, at least not to the cabin she knew. May 15th, 1963. Finished the lower chamber today. Margaret doesn't approve, says some things are better left buried. But she doesn't understand what we're protecting, what we're preserving. Lower chamber. Sarah sat back on her heels, studying the stone pattern beneath her. If this was just a floor, why had her grandfather written about it like a room? She pressed her palm flat against the stones, feeling for any give, any indication that something lay beneath. The third stone from the eastern wall shifted slightly under pressure. Her heart hammered as she worked her fingers around its edges, feeling mortar that crumbled at her touch. The stone lifted easier than she'd expected, revealing a darkness that seemed to exhale the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her stomach clench. A ladder descended into the black. Sarah's hands trembled as she lowered herself through the opening, each rung solid beneath her feet, despite the decades of neglect. The space below was larger than she'd imagined, carved from the mountain itself and reinforced with timber that had somehow remained sound. Her flashlight beams swept across walls lined with shelves, most empty now but bearing the rectangular outlines where boxes had once sat. In the far corner, a steel filing cabinet stood like a silent sentinel. The drawers opened with surprising ease, their contents organized with the same meticulous care her grandfather had brought to everything in his life. Files, photographs, and documents that made no immediate sense but carried the weight of importance in their careful preservation. She pulled the first folder, her grandfather's name written in his own hand across the tab, followed by a series of numbers that meant nothing to her. Inside, newspaper clippings from the 1940s and 50s, headlines that made her breath catch in her throat. Local mine disaster, claims 12 lives. Families demand investigation into Copper Creek collapse. Mining company settles wrongful death suits. Her grandfather's face stared back at her from one of the photos, decades younger but unmistakably him, standing with a group of men outside what the caption identified as the Copper Creek Mining Company headquarters. The article dated 3 months after the mine collapse that had killed 12 men and buried their families in debt and grief. Sarah's hands shook as she read the details. Faulty supports, ignored safety warnings, a cover-up that had cost lives and destroyed a community. Her grandfather's name appeared throughout the investigation records, not as a victim or even a witness, but as someone who'd known the truth and done nothing to stop it. The next folder contained bank records, deposits that began shortly after the mine disaster and continued monthly for nearly 40 years. Amounts that would have made her grandfather a wealthy man, payments from an entity listed only as CC Holdings. Hush money. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her distress, and Sarah pressed her free hand against her belly, trying to process what she was reading. Her grandfather, the man who'd taught her about honesty and hard work, who'd seemed to embody everything good about family and tradition, had been paid to keep silent about a tragedy that had destroyed dozens of lives. She pulled folder after folder, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy. Falsified safety reports bearing her grandfather's signature as head of the Miners' Safety Committee, testimony he'd given that contradicted his own private notes, evidence of bribes and threats and the systematic destruction of documents that might have brought justice to the families who'd lost everything. The final folder contained photographs that made her stomach turn. The mine itself, both before and after the collapse. Bodies being pulled from the wreckage, families standing beside fresh graves, and throughout it all, her grandfather's careful documentation of his own complicity, preserved like some twisted form of insurance policy. At the bottom of the file, a letter in her grandfather's handwriting addressed to no one and everyone. Some secrets are too heavy for one man to carry alone. I thought time would make it easier, but 40 years have only made the weight heavier. If someone finds this after I'm gone, know that I tried to make amends. The money went to the families, what I could manage without raising suspicion. But money doesn't bring back the dead or wash blood from guilty hands. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah pulled it from beneath the loose floorboard. Her hands trembled as she broke the brittle wax seal, and yellowed photographs spilled across the cabin floor like secrets finally released from their prison. The first image made her breath catch. A young woman with Sarah's own dark eyes stood beside a man in a military uniform, both smiling at the camera with the carefree abandon of youth. But it was the woman's rounded belly, clearly visible beneath her 1940s dress, that made Sarah's heart skip. Written on the back in fading ink, Margaret and James, 1943. Margaret, her grandfather's sister, who had supposedly died young and unmarried. Sarah spread the remaining photographs across the floor, each one telling a story that contradicted everything she'd been told about her family. Margaret cradling a newborn baby. Margaret teaching a toddler to walk in what looked like this very cabin. Margaret, older now, standing with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 10. The final photograph was different, darker, taken hastily. Margaret stood in the cabin doorway, fear etched across her features as she clutched the boy protectively against her side. Someone had written a single word on the back: hide. A sharp crack outside made Sarah's head snap up. Through the window, she could see a figure moving between the trees, too deliberate to be a wandering hiker. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the methodical pattern of someone searching. She quickly gathered the photographs and documents, stuffing them back into the envelope as footsteps approached the cabin. The front door was still barricaded from her earlier repairs, but she'd left the back entrance unlocked. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the rear door, the envelope clutched to her chest. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. Sarah counted to 60 before cautiously peering out the window. The forest appeared empty, but something felt wrong. The usual symphony of birds had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A gentle knock at the front door made her jump. "Sarah? It's Dr. Chen from the clinic. I wanted to check on you." Relief flooded through her until she remembered she'd never told Dr. Chen where she was staying. The knocking came again, more insistent. "I know you're in there, Sarah. I saw the smoke from your fire." She crept to the front window and peered through a gap in the boards. A woman stood on the porch, but she was definitely not Dr. Chen. This woman was tall and sharp-featured, wearing expensive hiking gear that looked like it had never seen a trail. "My name is Victoria Blackwood," the woman called out. "I think you have something that belongs to my family." Sarah's blood ran cold. Blackwood, she'd seen that name in her grandfather's journals, always followed by warnings to stay away and never trust them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Victoria's laugh was cold. "Oh, I think you do. You see, your grandfather was quite the collector of other people's secrets, but some of those secrets were never his to keep." Sarah thought of the photographs in the envelope, of Margaret's terrified face in that final image. "What do you want?" "What's rightfully mine? My grandfather's letters, certain photographs, documentation that your grandfather had no business keeping. I haven't found anything like that." "Come now, Sarah. We both know you're a thorough woman. After all, you managed to uncover your husband's affair quite efficiently." Victoria's voice carried a cruel satisfaction. "Yes, I know about David and his little secretary. I know about your divorce, your pregnancy, your rather desperate flight to this charming wilderness retreat." The casual invasion of her privacy made Sarah's skin crawl. "How do you know so much about you? Let's just say I make it my business to keep track of anyone who might stumble across family secrets. Your grandfather was quite the problem in that regard." Sarah's grip tightened on the envelope. "My grandfather died of a heart attack." "Did he?" Victoria's tone was conversational, but something deadly lurked beneath it. Funny how heart attacks can be so convenient, especially for elderly men who've been harboring dangerous information for decades. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. She pressed her back against the wall, her free hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her fear. "I'm going to leave now," Victoria announced, "but I'll be back tomorrow. I suggest you use that time to consider what's more important, protecting dead people's secrets or ensuring your own child's future safety." Footsteps retreated from the porch, but Sarah didn't move from her position until she heard a car engine starting in the distance. Only then did she allow herself to breathe fully again. With shaking hands, she pulled out the photographs once more, studying Margaret's frightened face in that final image. Whatever had happened to her grandfather's sister, whatever secrets these pictures held, someone was willing to kill to keep them buried. And now, Sarah was the only thing standing between truth and silence. The sledgehammer felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's trembling hands as she stood before the basement wall that had haunted her dreams for weeks. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to pulse in the flickering light of her headlamp, and somewhere behind that wall, she knew the truth waited. Marcus had left 3 voicemails since yesterday, each one more desperate than the last. She deleted them without listening past the first few seconds. Whatever lies he wanted to tell her now, whatever manipulation he crafted to explain away the affair, none of it mattered anymore. Not when she was standing on the precipice of something far more dangerous than a cheating husband. The first blow sent vibrations through her entire body. Dust and small chunks of mortar rained down, and she heard something shift behind the wall, a subtle settling sound that made her stomach clench. The baby gave a sharp kick, as if sensing her anxiety. "I know," she whispered, one hand moving to her belly. "Mama's scared too." But she couldn't stop now. Not after finding the newspaper clipping hidden in her grandfather's desk drawer just hours earlier. The headline had made her blood run cold. "Local woman vanishes during investigation into missing persons case." The article, dated just 2 months before her grandfather's sudden departure from the cabin, detailed how Rebecca Morrison, a freelance journalist, had been looking into a series of disappearances spanning 3 decades. All young women. All last seen near the forest roads that wound past the cabin. Sarah swung again, harder this time. A section of the wall cracked, revealing a dark hollow behind it. The smell that wafted out made her gag, musty and sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "Haven't heard from you in days. Getting worried. Please call." Sarah ignored it and continued her work. Each blow revealed more of the hidden space, and with growing horror, she realized it wasn't just a hollow in the wall. It was a carefully constructed hiding place, sealed with deliberate precision. When the hole was large enough, she aimed her headlamp inside and immediately wished she hadn't. Bones. Unmistakably human, wrapped in what had once been clothing. But it was the jewelry that made her legs give out. A delicate silver bracelet, tarnished with age, bearing the initials R.M. Rebecca Morrison, had been here all along, just yards from where Sarah had been sleeping. The sound of a car engine cutting through the evening air made her freeze. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Panic surged through her as she remembered the deputy's warning about staying vigilant, but as she climbed the basement stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, she recognized the silhouette through the window. It was Dr. Hayes. Sarah met him at the door, trying to compose herself despite the dust coating her clothes and the terror she knew must be written across her face. "Sarah, thank goodness," he said, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "I've been trying to reach you. There's something I need to tell you about your grandfather." "I think I already know," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. His eyes took in her disheveled appearance. The dirt under her fingernails, the way she kept glancing toward the basement door. "What have you found?" Instead of answering, she led him downstairs. The beam of his flashlight joined hers as they stood before the broken wall and its grisly contents. "Dear God," he breathed. "I was hoping I was wrong. You knew?" Dr. Hayes ran a hand through his grey hair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-odd years. "I suspected. Your grandfather. In his final days he was tormented, kept talking about the women in the walls and how he had to keep them quiet. We thought it was the dementia, but now, how many others are there?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know. But Sarah, you need to understand. Your grandfather wasn't well. Whatever happened here, whatever he did, it wasn't the man I knew. The disease had already started eating away at his mind years before anyone realized." A floorboard creaked overhead, and they both froze. Sarah was certain she'd locked the front door behind Dr. Hayes, but the sound came again. Deliberate footsteps moving through her kitchen. "Sarah?" a familiar voice called down. "I know you're here. Your car's outside." "Marcus." Dr. Hayes saw the terror in her eyes and immediately moved to position himself between her and the basement stairs. "Is there another way out?" he whispered. But it was too late. Marcus's footsteps were already on the stairs, and when he appeared in the circle of their flashlight beams, his face was a mask of cold determination that Sarah had never seen before. "Well," he said, his gaze taking in the broken wall and its contents with unsettling calm, "this certainly complicates things." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as morning light filtered through the newly repaired windows. Her grandfather's face stared back at her from the faded image, but it wasn't the gentle man she remembered from childhood visits. This version wore a uniform she didn't recognize, standing beside what looked like a military transport truck. Behind him, barely visible in the background, were structures that made her stomach turn: barbed wire, watchtowers, and rows of identical buildings that could only be one thing: a camp. She'd found the photo tucked inside a hollowed-out section of the cabin's main support beam while reinforcing the structure. Along with it was a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth, its pages yellow with age. The entries were written in her grandfather's careful handwriting, but the words described a man she'd never known existed. June 15th, 1943. "The new shipment arrived today. Watched them unload the trucks from my post. Their faces haunt me, but orders are orders. I tell myself it's temporary, that this madness will end soon." Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. Each entry painted a darker picture than the last. Her grandfather hadn't been the simple farmer she'd believed him to be. He'd been a guard at one of the internment camps, complicit in a system that had torn families apart and destroyed lives. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, trying to steady her breathing. Everything she thought she knew about her family, about this place she'd fled to for sanctuary, was built on lies. August 3rd, 1943. Can't sleep. The screaming from Block C went on for hours last night. I should have done something, but what? One man against the entire system. I'm a coward, and I know it. God forgive me for what I've become. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, and Sarah quickly stuffed the journal and photograph back into the support beam. Through the window, she saw Marcus approaching with his usual morning coffee and concerned expression. Since the incident with the intruder 2 weeks ago, he'd taken to checking on her daily, despite her protests that she could handle herself. "Morning," he called out, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. "How are you feeling today?" She opened the door, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Better. The morning sickness seems to be easing up." Marcus studied her face with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right?" Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell him everything, to share the burden of what she'd discovered, but another part, the part that had learned not to trust easily after David's betrayal, held her back. How well did she really know Marcus? What if he was connected to whoever had been watching the cabin? "Just tired," she said, accepting the coffee he offered. "I've been working on the support beams. Found some rot I need to replace. Need help? I've got some free time today." "No, I've got it handled." The lie came easily, but it tasted bitter. She was becoming someone she didn't recognize, secretive, suspicious, isolated. The pregnancy hormones weren't helping her emotional state, making everything feel more intense and overwhelming. Marcus lingered on the porch, clearly wanting to say more. Sarah, I hope you know you can trust me. If something's wrong—" I said, "I'm fine." The words came out sharper than she intended, and she saw him flinch slightly. Immediately, she felt guilty. He'd done nothing but help her since she'd arrived, and here she was pushing him away because of her grandfather's ancient sins. "Okay," he said quietly, "but the offer stands, day or night." After he left, Sarah returned to the journal, driven by a morbid need to know the full truth. The entries grew progressively darker, describing her grandfather's growing horror at what he was witnessing and his own inability to act. But it was the final entry that made her blood run cold. December 18th, 1943. "They're shutting down the camp, sending us all to different posts to keep us quiet about what happened here. Before I left, I took something, evidence of what we did. Insurance, or maybe just guilt, hidden it where no one will think to look. If anything happens to me, if they come for me, at least there will be a record. Some truths are too important to bury." Evidence. Her grandfather had hidden evidence of war crimes, and if it was still here somewhere, it could destroy not just his memory but potentially implicate others who were still alive, people who would kill to keep their secrets buried. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The mysterious watcher, the break-in attempt, the subtle questions from townspeople about what she'd found in the cabin. They weren't interested in her. They were searching for whatever her grandfather had hidden. Sarah pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the baby's steady movements. She'd come here seeking sanctuary, but instead she'd stumbled into the middle of a decades-old conspiracy, and now she was carrying not just new life, but potentially explosive secrets that others would kill to protect. The storm hit without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as midnight. Maya pressed herself against the cabin's newly reinforced wall as wind howled through the trees, sending debris flying past the windows. She'd been organizing the documents she'd found, trying to make sense of the tangled web of her grandfather's past, when the first crack of thunder shook the entire structure. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, violent flashes. In those brief moments, Maya caught glimpses of trees bending at impossible angles, their branches whipping like angry tentacles. The baby kicked restlessly in her belly, as if sensing the chaos outside. She moved away from the windows, gathering the scattered papers from where the wind had blown them when she'd rushed to secure the shutters. Her hands trembled as she sorted through photographs of her grandfather, with men whose faces she was beginning to recognize from old newspaper clippings. The same faces that appeared in reports about missing persons, unexplained deaths, families who had simply vanished from the area decades ago. A tremendous crash echoed from somewhere nearby, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Maya's heart hammered as she realized it had come from the direction of the old well. She grabbed a flashlight and her rain jacket, knowing she had to check despite the danger. If a tree had fallen across the well opening, it might be visible from other parts of the property. She couldn't risk exposure. The rain struck her like ice needles as she stepped outside. The wind nearly knocked her sideways, and she had to grab the porch railing to steady herself. Through the storm's fury, she could barely make out the path to the well. Lightning flashed again, and she saw it. A massive pine had toppled, its trunk crushing the wooden platform she'd built over the well mouth. Relief flooded through her. The tree would actually provide better concealment than her makeshift cover, but as she turned to go back inside, another flash of lightning revealed something that made her blood freeze. Fresh tire tracks in the mud leading up the mountain road toward her cabin. Someone had come up here during the storm. Maya killed the flashlight and pressed herself against the cabin wall, scanning the darkness between lightning strikes. The tracks were new. The rain would have washed away anything from earlier in the day. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who would drive up here in weather like this? Who even knew she was here? A beam of light swept across the trees about 50 yards down the slope, then another from a different direction. Multiple people, searching the woods with flashlights, moving toward her. Maya slipped back inside and quickly gathered the most damaging documents, stuffing them into a waterproof bag along with her grandfather's journal. Her hands shook as she tried to think clearly. The storm would mask her movements, but it would also make escape treacherous, and in her condition, running through the wilderness at night was nearly impossible. She heard voices now, muffled by wind and rain but growing closer, male voices, at least two of them. One called out something she couldn't quite catch, but the tone was authoritative, determined. These weren't lost hikers. Moving as quietly as possible, Maya grabbed supplies from her emergency kit, water, energy bars, her grandfather's hunting knife. She'd prepared for this possibility, though she'd hoped it would never come. There was a root cellar beneath the cabin that her grandfather had modified, creating a hidden space behind the main storage area. She'd discovered it while reinforcing the floorboards, along with evidence that he'd used it to hide much more than food. The voices were closer now, and she could see flashlight beams playing across the cabin's windows. Maya lifted the concealed floorboard and lowered herself into the space below, pulling the board back into position above her head. The hidden chamber was cramped and musty, but it had saved her grandfather more than once, according to his journal. Through gaps in the floorboards, she watched boots cross the cabin's main room, heavy boots moving with purpose. She counted at least 3 sets of feet. "She's been here recently," a voice said. "Food's still fresh, fire's warm. Check everything, documents, photographs, anything that looks like evidence." Maya's breath caught. They knew. Somehow they knew what she'd found. "Boss isn't going to like this," another voice added. He thought this was all buried with the old man. Should have burned this place down years ago instead of just scaring people away. The men continued searching above her, and Maya heard them moving furniture, opening cabinets, rifling through her belongings. The baby shifted restlessly, and she pressed a hand to her belly, silently pleading for stillness. One set of boots stopped directly above her hiding spot. Maya held her breath, certain the pounding of her heart would give her away. The storm raged on outside, but down in the darkness of her grandfather's secret, she felt more trapped than protected. The footsteps moved away, and she heard the men talking near the door. But their words were lost in another crash of thunder, leaving Maya to wonder how long she could remain hidden and what they planned to do when they found her. The floorboards groaned under Maya's weight as she paced the cabin's main room, clutching the yellowed photograph in trembling hands. Outside, dawn was breaking through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the evidence scattered on her grandfather's desk, documents that painted a horrifying picture of the man she'd idolized her entire life. Her phone buzzed against the wooden surface, vibrating insistently. David's name flashed on the screen for the 20th time since midnight. She'd stopped answering after his increasingly desperate voicemails revealed that he knew exactly where she was. And worse, why she'd run. "Maya, please pick up. I know about the cabin. I know what you found. We need to talk before you do something you'll regret." The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who'd shattered her world with his betrayal was now warning her about regret. She placed a protective hand over her growing belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Even her unborn child seemed to sense the danger closing in around them. The photograph showed her grandfather standing beside a black sedan, his arm draped around the shoulders of a young woman Maya now knew was Elena Vasquez, the same woman whose missing person report she'd found hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards. Elena's bright smile and hopeful eyes stared back at Maya, frozen in time from 40 years ago, before she'd vanished without a trace. The sound of tires crunching on gravel sent ice through Maya's veins. She moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the faded curtains. A dark SUV sat in her driveway, engine ticking as it cooled. The driver's door opened, and Maya's heart stopped. It wasn't David. The man who emerged was tall and weathered, with steel-grey hair and cold eyes that swept the cabin's exterior with practiced efficiency. He moved with the deliberate gait of someone accustomed to finding what he was looking for. Maya recognized him from another photograph she'd discovered, one that showed him decades younger, standing beside her grandfather at some long-ago family gathering. Uncle Robert, her grandfather's business partner. The man who'd always sent her birthday cards and Christmas gifts, who'd spoken so fondly at her grandfather's funeral about their shared ventures in the logging industry. Maya's research had revealed that those ventures extended far beyond timber. She grabbed her laptop bag and stuffed the incriminating documents inside, her movements frantic but silent. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the surge of adrenaline flooding her system. Through the window, she watched Robert approach the front steps, his hand resting casually inside his jacket in a way that made her blood run cold. The back door was her only option. Maya slipped through the kitchen, grateful for the oil she'd used to quiet the hinges during her renovation work. The forest behind the cabin was dense with underbrush, offering cover if she could reach it without being seen. Her foot hit a loose board on the back porch, and the resulting crack seemed to echo through the morning stillness. Maya froze, listening. Footsteps had stopped at the front of the cabin. Then came the sound of the front door opening. She'd forgotten to lock it, never imagining she'd need to fear anyone other than David finding her. "Maya?" Robert's voice carried through the cabin, deceptively warm and familiar. "I know you're here, sweetheart. Your car's out front, and frankly, you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest with your little treasure hunt." She forced herself to move, stepping carefully toward the tree line. Behind her, Robert's footsteps echoed through the cabin as he searched from room to room. "I was hoping we could handle this the easy way," he continued, his voice growing more distant as she gained ground. "Your grandfather was always fond of you. Said you were the smart one in the family. Too smart for your own good, it seems." Maya reached the first cluster of pine trees and pressed her back against the largest trunk, trying to control her ragged breathing. The laptop bag felt impossibly heavy, weighted down with evidence of murders that had been disguised as disappearances, of a human trafficking operation that had used the family's logging business as cover for decades. Her grandfather hadn't just been involved, he'd been the architect. "Found your research, Maya," Robert called out, his voice now coming from the back porch. "Very thorough work. You inherited his attention to detail, I'll give you that. But you also inherited his sense of family loyalty, didn't you? Surely we can work something out." Maya's phone buzzed with a text message. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, she glanced at the screen. "David, Robert isn't working alone. Thompson from the sheriff's department is with him. They're not there to talk. Get out now." Her blood turned to ice. David's betrayal suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the realization that her grandfather's criminal network was still very much alive, and now they knew she possessed evidence that could destroy them all. The sound of breaking branches told her that Robert had given up on negotiation. He was coming for her. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Sarah's feet, despite the warm afternoon sun. She clutched the manila envelope containing the DNA test results, her knuckles white against the brown paper. Inside, the documents confirmed what she'd suspected since finding those photographs in the cabin's hidden room. She wasn't Thomas Whitmore's biological granddaughter. Marcus stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." Sarah's voice was stronger than she felt. "This is something I need to face." The law office of Peterson and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. Sarah's palms were damp as she climbed the narrow staircase, each step bringing her closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Eleanor Peterson was younger than Sarah had expected, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She gestured for Sarah to sit across from her mahogany desk, which was covered in neat stacks of legal documents. "Ms. Chen," Eleanor began, using Sarah's maiden name. "I understand you have questions about the Whitmore estate." Sarah placed the envelope on the desk. "I have reason to believe that Thomas Whitmore wasn't my biological grandfather. These DNA results confirm it." Eleanor's expression didn't change as she reviewed the documents. "I see. And what outcome are you seeking from this revelation?" "I want to know if I have any legal claim to the cabin. I've been living there, renovating it. I thought it was my inheritance, but if I'm not actually related to Thomas..." The law isn't always about blood, Miss Chen. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. Thomas Whitmore's will explicitly states that the property goes to the granddaughter known as Sarah Whitmore, not to his biological granddaughter, but to you specifically. Sarah felt her breath catch. What does that mean? It means Thomas knew. Eleanor opened a file drawer and withdrew a thick folder. He came to me 3 years before his death to update his will. He told me he suspected you weren't his son's biological child, but that you were his granddaughter in every way that mattered. The room seemed to spin slightly. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair. He knew, and he still left me the cabin? More than that. Eleanor pulled out a sealed letter. He left this for you, with instructions that it only be given to you if you discovered the truth about your parentage. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Her name was written across the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've learned what I suspected for years. Your mother's affair broke my son's heart, but it gave our family something precious, you. I watched you grow into a woman of strength and integrity, and I couldn't be prouder if you shared my blood. The cabin is yours by right, not of birth, but of love. You were the only one who truly understood what that place meant to me. I trust you'll honor its legacy and make it a home filled with the love it deserves. There's something else you should know. The man your mother had the affair with, I hired a private investigator years ago. His name was Daniel Morrison, and he died in a car accident when you were 5. He never knew about you, but he was a good man. Your mother loved him, and I believe that love created something beautiful. Don't let this knowledge burden you, child. You are exactly who you're meant to be. With all my love, Grandpa Thomas. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she finished reading. She looked up to find Eleanor watching her with something approaching kindness. There's one more thing, Eleanor said. Thomas also established a trust fund for the cabin's maintenance and for any children you might have. He wanted to ensure that property would remain in your family for generations. Sarah pressed a hand to her belly, where her daughter was growing strong. Even though we're not his blood family. Family isn't just about genetics. Miss Chen Thomas understood that better than most. Walking back down those courthouse steps, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. The afternoon sun seemed brighter, the air cleaner. Marcus was waiting by his truck, concern written across his features. How did it go? The cabin is mine, she said simply. It's really mine. He smiled, and she realized how much his support had meant through all of this. Then let's go home. Home. The word felt right in a way it hadn't for a long time. The cabin wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was her legacy, her daughter's birthright, and the foundation of whatever future she chose to build. As Marcus drove them back toward the mountains, Sarah watched the familiar landscape roll past the windows. Somewhere in those hills, her cabin waited, solid and welcoming. Tomorrow she would continue the renovations with new purpose, knowing she was building something that would last. The floorboards groaned beneath Sarah's feet as she paced the cabin main room, her hands pressed protectively over her rounded belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. Through the window, she could see Marcus's truck parked at the edge of the clearing, its chrome bumper glinting in the morning sun like a predator's teeth. He'd arrived 3 hours ago, demanding entry, his voice carrying threats that made her blood run cold. The restraining order meant nothing out here, miles from civilization, where cell service was spotty and help was non-existent. Sarah had barricaded the door with her grandfather's heavy oak dresser, but she knew it wouldn't hold forever. Sarah! Open this damn door! Marcus's fist hammered against the wood, causing the entire frame to shudder. I know what you found down there. You have no idea what you're playing with. Her gaze drifted to the basement entrance, where the hidden room still gaped open like a wound. The photographs and documents she'd discovered were now spread across the kitchen table, evidence of her grandfather's involvement in something far darker than she'd ever imagined. The faces in those pictures haunted her. Young women who'd gone missing decades ago, their smiles frozen in time before they'd encountered whatever evil had touched her family. But it wasn't just her grandfather's secrets that terrified her now. Among the papers, she'd found recent correspondence, letters bearing Marcus's signature alongside her grandfather's. They'd known each other. They'd worked together. "I trusted you with everything," she whispered to the empty room, remembering how Marcus had encouraged her to come to the cabin, how he'd seemed so understanding about her need for space. It hadn't been understanding at all. It had been manipulation, steering her exactly where he wanted her. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by an ominous silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. She moved carefully to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains. Marcus's truck was gone, but that didn't bring relief. If anything, it made her more afraid. He was planning something. A soft creaking from above made her freeze. Footsteps on the roof. Her heart hammered as she realized he'd found another way in. The cabin had weak spots, rotted sections she hadn't yet repaired, places where determined hands could pull away boards and create an opening. Sarah grabbed the hunting rifle from its mount above the fireplace, her hands trembling as she checked the chamber. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot when she was 12, but she'd never imagined she'd need to defend herself in his own home. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking protection in a place that harbored such darkness. A crash from the loft sent dust raining down from the ceiling. He was inside. "There's nowhere to run, Sarah." Marcus's voice drifted down from above, calm and conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. "This place is miles from anywhere. No one even knows you're here." But that wasn't true anymore. Sarah had called Detective Rivera before the cell towers went down during yesterday's storm, had told her about the hidden room and what she'd found. Help would come eventually, but eventually might be too late. The baby kicked hard, as if urging her to move. Sarah crept toward the kitchen, where the back door offered her only escape route. But as she passed the table covered in evidence, she stopped. These documents were the only proof of what Marcus and her grandfather had done. If she ran, if something happened to her, no one would ever know the truth about those missing women. Heavy footsteps descended the loft ladder. Sarah made her choice, snatching up the most damning photographs and letters, stuffing them inside her jacket, before slipping toward the rear of the cabin. The back door opened silently. She'd oiled those hinges just days ago, never thinking her maintenance work might save her life. The forest welcomed her with shadows and the scent of pine. Sarah moved as quietly as her pregnant body would allow, following the deer path she'd discovered during her daily walks. Behind her, she could hear Marcus searching the cabin, his voice rising in frustration when he realized she'd escaped. The path led to a rocky outcropping where cell service sometimes returned. Sarah climbed carefully, her breath coming in short gasps, the rifle heavy in her grip. At the top, her phone showed one precious bar of signal. She dialed 911, whispering her location to the dispatcher, begging them to hurry. Below, Marcus emerged from the cabin, his face turned upward as he scanned the tree line. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah saw something in his expression that chilled her to the bone. Not anger, but satisfaction, as if everything was going according to plan. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He'd wanted her to run. He'd driven her into the wilderness deliberately, away from the safety of the cabin's walls and into terrain where accidents happened all too easily. Sarah gripped the rifle tighter and prepared to fight for 2 lives. The hospital room felt suffocating despite the antiseptic smell and humming fluorescent lights. Sarah's hand rested protectively over her belly while Detective Morrison sat across from her, his weathered face grave with the weight of what he'd discovered. "We found 3 more bodies on your grandfather's property," he said quietly, "all buried in the same manner as the one you uncovered. The forensics team estimates they've been there for decades." Sarah's throat tightened. She'd known this moment would come ever since she'd found that first shallow grave, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach churn. "Do you know who they were?" Morrison consulted his notes. "We're still working on identification, but we found some personal effects. Wedding rings, a locket with initials. One victim appears to be a young woman, probably in her 20s. He paused, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. "There's something else. We found documents hidden in your grandfather's workshop. Letters, photographs, what looks like trophies. The baby kicked hard against Sarah's ribs, as if sensing her distress. She pressed her palm against the movement, trying to steady herself. What kind of trophies? Items belonging to the victims. Hair ribbons, jewelry, pieces of clothing. Morrison leaned forward. Sarah, your grandfather wasn't just hiding bodies on that property. Based on what we've found, we believe he was responsible for at least 4 murders spanning 2 decades. The words hit her like physical blows. She thought of all the hours she'd spent in that cabin, sleeping in his bed, cooking in his kitchen, lovingly restoring the home he'd built with blood on his hands, the walls she'd repaired, the floorboards she'd sanded. How many secrets had she unknowingly preserved? The local missing persons cases from the 70s and 80s, Morrison continued. Young women who vanished without a trace. We think we know what happened to them now. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. I lived there for months. I slept there. My baby... She couldn't finish the sentence. You couldn't have known, Morrison said gently. But there's more we need to discuss. The man who attacked you last night, Marcus Henley. His sister was one of the victims. She disappeared in 1982 when she was 23. The room seemed to spin. He knew? All this time, he knew what happened to her. He'd been tracking down leads for years. When he discovered you were living on the property, he must have thought you were involved somehow, or that you knew more than you were letting on. Morrison's expression darkened. That doesn't excuse what he tried to do to you, but it explains his desperation. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Marcus's wild accusations, his rage-filled eyes in the moonlight. The way he'd grabbed her, shaken her, demanded answers she didn't have. She thought of his sister, barely older than Sarah was now, trusting someone who seemed safe before her world ended in that isolated wilderness. What happens now? She whispered. The property is a crime scene. You won't be able to return, at least not for a long time. We need to process everything thoroughly. Morrison's voice softened. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know that place meant something to you. Meant something to her. Sarah almost laughed at the understatement. That cabin had been her salvation, her refuge when her world collapsed. She'd poured her heart into rebuilding it, believing she was honoring her grandfather's memory. Instead, she'd been lovingly restoring a monument to horror. Did my mother know? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Morrison shook his head. Nothing suggests she was aware. Your grandfather was careful, methodical. He maintained his reputation in town, kept to himself just enough to avoid suspicion, but not so much as to seem strange. The perfect facade. Sarah thought of the few childhood visits she remembered, how her grandfather had seemed quiet but kind, teaching her to identify bird calls and showing her how to split kindling. Had those same hands that guided hers committed unspeakable acts? A nurse entered to check Sarah's vitals, and Morrison stood. I'll need you to come to the station in the next few days to give a full statement. About everything. Finding the body, your time at the property, last night's attack. After he left, Sarah stared out the hospital window at the parking lot below. Cars came and went, people living their normal lives, unaware that everything she'd built her hope on had crumbled to dust. The cabin that had sheltered her was tainted beyond redemption. The legacy she'd thought she was preserving was actually a curse she'd been nurturing. She felt the baby move again, a flutter of life against her palm. Whatever happened next, she had to protect this innocent soul from the darkness that seemed to follow her family name. The cabin was lost to her, but perhaps that was for the best. Some things were too broken to rebuild. Tomorrow, she would have to start over again. The sirens had long since faded into the distance, taking Marcus away in handcuffs and leaving behind only the acrid smell of smoke and the echo of revelations that had shattered everything Sarah thought she knew about her family. She stood in the clearing where her grandfather's cabin had been reduced to charred timbers and ash, one hand pressed protectively over her rounded belly. Detective Martinez approached carefully, his weathered face etched with concern. We found the bodies, Sarah. 3 of them, buried exactly where you said they'd be. Your grandfather's journal will be crucial evidence in reopening these cold cases." Sarah nodded numbly, still processing the weight of it all. The journal that had revealed her grandfather's dark secret, his role in covering up murders committed by the mining company he'd worked for, now felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her hands. The very man she'd idealized, whose memory had given her strength to rebuild her life, had been complicit in burying the truth along with innocent victims. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Justice, finally, for those families who never knew what happened to their loved ones." Martinez paused, studying her face. "And you're going to be okay. You did the right thing." As the detective walked away to coordinate with the forensics team, Sarah found herself truly alone for the first time in months. The cabin that had been her sanctuary was gone, destroyed in Marcus's desperate attempt to eliminate the evidence she'd uncovered. But strangely, she didn't feel the crushing despair she'd expected. The baby kicked sharply against her ribs, as if reminding her that she wasn't really alone at all. She placed both hands on her belly and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine peace, not the fragile happiness she'd built with Marcus, constructed on lies and his careful manipulation, but real peace that came from finally knowing the truth, no matter how painful. Emma's truck rumbled up the dirt road, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the friend who had become more like a sister. Emma had been the one to call the police when Sarah's frantic phone call had cut short, had guided them to the cabin when Marcus's true nature had finally revealed itself. "Jesus, Sarah." Emma climbed out of the truck, her eyes wide as she took in the destruction. "When I got your call, I thought I might be too late." Sarah embraced her friend, drawing strength from the solid warmth of human connection. "You weren't too late. You saved my life. Both our lives." She gestured to her belly. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the investigators methodically process the scene. Sarah's phone buzzed. Her lawyer, probably, or maybe her mother, who had been calling incessantly since news of Marcus's arrest had broken. She ignored it. Those conversations could wait. "Where will you go now?" Emma asked gently. Sarah considered the question. The cabin had been her refuge, but it had also been a prison of sorts, keeping her isolated and hiding from the world. Now, with the truth finally exposed and Marcus facing charges for arson, fraud, and accessory after the fact to murder, she was free to make choices based on what she actually wanted, not what she was running from. "I have some money set aside," she said slowly. "Money Marcus never knew about. Maybe it's time to stop hiding." Emma smiled. "There's a little house for rent in town. Nothing fancy, but it has a nursery that gets beautiful morning light." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. For the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, she was crying from hope. "That sounds perfect." As they walked back toward Emma's truck, Sarah took one last look at the ruins of the cabin. Her grandfather had been a flawed man who'd made terrible choices, but he'd also been someone who'd eventually found the courage to document the truth, even if he'd been too afraid to act on it while alive. Maybe redemption could be inherited along with guilt. The journal would help bring closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. Marcus would face the consequences of his actions, and she would raise her daughter, somehow she knew it was a daughter, with honesty and courage, breaking the cycle of secrets that had poisoned her family for too long. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Sarah found herself smiling despite everything. She'd lost a husband who'd never truly loved her, a home built on false foundations, and the idealized memory of her grandfather, but she'd gained something infinitely more valuable, the truth and the freedom that came with it. As Emma's truck carried them away from the clearing, Sarah didn't look back. The past had been excavated and examined. Now it was time to build something new, something real, from the ground up.